Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
Keith Wolahan is a rare creature in today's Liberal Party. He's a moderate and often an outspoken one at that. Last year, he narrowly lost his Victorian seat of Menzies in the Labor tsunami. It was once safe Liberal. The Liberal Party is now confronting questions about its long-term existence in face of the One Nation surge. Keith Wolahan joins us today to talk about the issues facing the party as it looks to this uncertain future. Keith Wolahan, let's start with your own future. Are you going to recontest Menzies?
More likely than not, but I won't make a decision on that until the Liberal Party opens pre-selections, which will probably be sometime early next year. And I will definitely consult with my family. I'd like to think we've both enjoyed spending a lot more time with each other.
Menzies is an inner suburban electorate in the east of Melbourne, suburbs like Doncaster, Box Hill, Blackburn. As you move around this electorate, very much middle Australia, isn't it? What's the community saying to you about the Liberal Party?
You're right. Menzies is very typical of Melbourne electorates and Sydney electorates, which are the bulk of the parliament. 57% of the Commonwealth Parliament is metropolitan seats like Menzies. If I could summarise it this way, it would be a plea to do better. These are communities that are hardworking, aspirational, and for the most part have values that align with the Liberal Party's core values, even if it's not partisan. But for many, particularly younger people and new migrants, the Liberal Party hasn't made the case that those values do align. We have assumed that they're self-evident, and we haven't made the case. And part of making the case is turning up, seeing people, recognising them, and making a commitment that we're in it to fight for them, not for ourselves.
But do you have to persuade people better that the Liberal Party is in tune with how they see the world, what they want, these sorts of things?
We do. I think that challenge has always been there in politics, but I think with the media being more fragmented and curated, and for some migrant communities, often it's in your own language on a particular app, there isn't that family gathering around the evening news or the table that has a newspaper where you're hearing talking points from both sides. I think there's less exposure to the major parties, less exposure to what they stand for, who they are, and where they differ. And I think we can't assume that there's a broad understanding in the community about the core values of the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, how they're different. And it's for us to make that case. And can I give an example? I was invited after the election to an Asian Small Business Awards in the city in Melbourne. There were about 600 people there, and I was the only Liberal. I wasn't speaking, but there were many Labor members who turned up, to their credit, and spoke. And I listened, and I thought if I migrated to Australia in the last few years, I would assume Labor is the party of small business. Now, I would think that is preposterous, and Labor would push back. But if Liberal Party isn't in rooms like that, if we're not making that case about how we're fighting for small business, then you cannot assume that that knowledge is known, and the onus is on the Liberal Party to work harder.
We are seeing, and have seen now for quite a long time, this move away from the major parties. We see it in the low level of the primary vote they get. Do you think there's an argument that this tide is just going out, that it can't be reversed?
I think there's two parts to politics. If you look in deeper history, there are certainly cyclical elements to politics, and that has been how the lens that it has normally been viewed through. And it's why when you get to the end of a stale government, you think, oh, well, just, they will lose. We don't even need to make the case to win. I don't think that applies anymore. I think there are structural changes in Australia and in politics. Part of that is driven by fragmented media. Part of it is driven by a sense of deep dissatisfaction that the promises that previous generation had aren't there for this generation or the next one. I'm still an optimist. I think in the end, people want governments of competence and character. And for all their flaws, major political parties are great mechanisms to resolve conflicts, bring people together, but above all else, do so on a foundational belief in values that matter to that party. And I think you need that to bring a party with you. And if you look at other democracies where the parliaments are completely fragmented, I don't think that has served those countries well. And I think it will rebalance, but you cannot assume that it will happen.
I think people have been a bit stunned by that Redbridge poll the other day, which had an analysis nationwide of seats. And it showed One Nation winning some 53 seats in the 150 House of Representatives, and the Coalition are only winning 12. And in fact being wiped out from Queensland, Western Australia and South Australia. The Liberals do, however, according to that poll, retain Menzies, so I suppose it had at least a silver lining for you, but you might have been pretty lonely in a new parliament. What do you make of this poll, and do you think the Liberal Party is now fighting for its very existence, even though you remain optimistic?
I think it is fighting for its existence, but I think that poll is one of a long line of wake-up calls for the party. I think 2022 results in terms of metropolitan seats was a massive wake-up call for the Liberal Party. I thought the by-election defeats in Aston and Dunkley were wake-up calls. I thought the 2025 result obviously is a wake-up call. South Australia is a wake-up call. Farah is a wake-up call. So the temperature has been turned up for so long now. I don't think any frog in the water should be surprised that it is now boiling.
They never seem to wake up, though. That's the problem, isn't it? The Liberals are caught between One Nation on the right and the Teals and other community candidates, as well as Labor on their left. How do they deal with this? Should they move right? Should they move left? Shouldn't they move at all?
This is the question of our time. There is a huge divide between two Australias, between a rural and regional Australia that doesn't have the same levels of asset ownership, income, and higher education. It's also generally less diverse. And then metropolitan Australia, which has generally higher education, higher incomes, but probably lower assets in terms of home ownership. There's also differences in birth rates. There's differences in views of the world. And I'm worried that we're dividing further apart. And I think One Nation is having a surge, but it's really only in the rural and regional areas, in the outer metropolitan areas. And I would hate to see a point where the two Australias have a disdain for each other, because we're all Australians and we need to be unified. I think the way to speak to both audiences without tripping yourself over or being insincere is to focus on aspiration and economics. Because for all the talk of privileges and different backgrounds on race or gender, that you don't have any privilege if you can't put food on the table. You don't have any hope if you can't aspire to own a home. And so I think those topics speak to both Australias. Those topics allow you to bring people together. But we should never forget, though, that it's for the Liberal Party in particular, and I'd like to think the Labor Party, we should lean into a unifying version of patriotism, a healthy patriotism. Of course, there's unhealthy nationalism, but there's a healthy patriotism that I think Australia is crying out for at the moment.
In 2024, you pointed to the need for the coalition to address its, and I quote you, overwhelming deficit of support among younger generations. But it hasn't been able to do this, has it? Its figures of support among the young are very low, very concerning for the Liberals and the Nationals. What should it be doing on this front?
You quoted Redbridge polling. There was a previous Redbridge poll that I noticed that had the Liberal Party with an 11% primary on renters, which are generally more younger people. I think there are many things that matter for young people, but what I hear and see more often is a lack of hope in the future. And we never want young people to feel like that. We want each generation of Australians to aspire to be more prosperous and free and better than the ones that came before. There is a feeling that that social contract, that you can work hard, take a risk, and you can aspire to own your own home, have your own family, and pass on something else to the next generation. There's a feeling that that contract is broken. And I think at the core of that is home ownership, but just also a sense of hope that people can aspire to be better. And we need to give that back to them in a way that is meaningful. It's not just platitudes.
John Howard used to talk about the party as being a broad church, but now the moderates have nearly disappeared from the Parliamentary Liberal Party. Is this because they've lost their seats, moderates have lost their seats, or are they being ground into relative silence by a party that's now dominated at the parliamentary level as well as the organisational level by Conservatives?
I've never embraced those labels like a lot of the press gallery and insiders in politics do. For this reason, I actually think that they're largely labels that describe personality groupings, factions, or competition within a party. When you actually interrogate the core beliefs of people who identify as conservatives or moderates, there's so much more overlap than there is difference. A lot of it is driven by power and personality. I actually think the bigger divide that we're seeing is that there's less metropolitan members in the party room. When I went there, I noticed that the metropolitan members were a minority. So we started our own little breakfast to share metropolitan concerns. There's now only a handful, like hardly any. So the Liberal Party, when Tony Abbott was elected, had 44 metropolitan seats. It now has 9, and only 2 of those are inner metropolitan. So what's missing from the party room is more about the type of Australia that you represent. And given that that is the majority at 57%, that is a huge gap of voices being heard in the party room.
Now, you mentioned Farah, the recent by-election. In that by-election, the Liberals preferenced One Nation over a community independent. In this case, One Nation would have won anyway, but as a general principle, should the Liberals preference One Nation, won't that just help One Nation win seats and be even more of a threat to the Liberal Party?
This isn't an easy decision. It should be done on a seat-by-seat assessment, because sometimes whatever party someone is in, there are extraordinarily bad candidates with a terrible track record, and that should be assessed seat by seat. Politics is also about maths, and you have to recognize that while the Liberal Party, its mission is to defeat all other parties, including One Nation, it has to do that in a way that focuses primarily on forming a coalition majority. And so whatever the decision is, it has to be made with that in mind. And in return, there will be a scare campaign that will be run, and you see it being run here in Victoria. That's going to happen anyway. So the Labor Party is ruthless about forming a majority, and it does so with its preferences with the Greens. The Liberal Party should be principled, but it should also be aware of the raw politics of maths, because you are not advancing this nation or your cause if you are in permanent opposition.
Well, how far would you take that if the Liberals were in a position of potential minority government and One Nation MPs would make the difference? Should they enter some arrangement with those MPs?
So there are lines in the sand, and one of the lines in the sand, from my perspective, is that we should rule out coalitions. And these are obviously hypotheticals, and parliamentarians don't like answering hypotheticals, but I think you can do that. And what makes that, it's not a hard thing to say, A, because it's right, but B, I think even One Nation says that too.
Now, the Liberal Party's federal council is being held in Melbourne at the weekend, and that will formally install Tony Abbott as your party president. He's a big personality and he likes to be on the political stage. So we can, I think, expect to hear quite a lot from him over the next couple of years in the run-up to the next election. Is this going to be good for the Liberal Party, or is this going to, in fact, add to its problems?
I think the Liberal Party needs as many passionate, articulate, conviction people it can. And I think Tony ticks off on all of those. No one agrees with everyone else in the Liberal Party on every issue. And there are things, Tony fights hard for that I have a different view on, but there's so much more that we're united by. He's an amazing writer. I read his book over summer and I couldn't put it down. It was really, really good. And we want people, former prime ministers, to write more, to speak more, to care more. And I think what people see in Tony is a passionate person. And what I would like us to do as a nation is get to a place where you can say, I don't agree with you on everything, but I respect that you do. I respect that you have stood up for that forcefully. And that elevating debate is something we need to do within the party. And it's something then that we need to spread throughout this nation, because the way we debate, I think, really matters for our democracy.
Let's look at a couple of issues around the budget and Angus Taylor's budget reply. To go back again to some comments you made in 2024, you said that if the Liberals were serious about home ownership and aspiration, and I quote, "we will pursue policies that both boost supply and tip the hand of first home buyers over investors." Right now, you said, there is an imbalance the other way, particularly for established stock, end of quote. So do you support what the government is doing in dealing with this imbalance by changing negative gearing and capital gains tax arrangements?
I wrote a long essay over summer when I was on holiday in New Zealand with my family, and I looked at this as one of the many issues that matter. And what struck me was that in 2025, when you looked at the investor loans in Australia, 82% went to existing stock. So it did bother me that not all investment leads to supply. And if there was a way that and I think negative gearing is very important, but if you could tilt it and shift it in a way to new stock, you should do that. That said, you should either always put that to the people at an election or seek a mandate from the opposition, do it together. Both of those weren't sought. So they've crashed through, didn't bring it to the Australian people. So I don't have many problems with the negative gearing proposal, but I do have a problem with the way that it has been done. It hasn't been put to Australians. I think there is no mandate for the CGT changes, and the fact that it is being sold as a way to solve the housing crisis, but expands to all asset classes, including shares and businesses, I think that is one of the most egregious breaches in politics in recent times. And it is no surprise that there has been an outrage from Australians who are trying not only to build their own businesses, but to employ people and to keep what they have built here. We are in a global race for capital and talent, and I'm worried that this decision will send both overseas.
So leaving aside the breach of promises, which you're obviously condemning totally, you would not necessarily have a problem with the government's capital gains tax change if it only applied to the property sector.
Well, I would be a hypocrite if I didn't acknowledge I wrote an essay that said my proposal was to limit it to one, so to grandfather all existing arrangements. I think people who invest in Australia need certainty, and to limit it to one existing stock and then to uncap it or have a higher cap for new stock. I think that's sensible, but reasonable people can disagree about that within my party. But I think the fundamental point that it should have either been done in a bipartisan way or taken to an election is one that should be prosecuted.
Now, on Angus Taylor's budget reply, you were very praiseworthy of his move to index tax brackets, but this is an enormously expensive proposal. And wouldn't it, in fact, need to be accompanied by much more specific plans to cut government spending? Because just talking in very general terms or just speaking around the edges of spending won't cut it, surely.
I praised it because it is a bold decision, and I think that's what Australia needs. It's in Australia's interests. But also we have to have a conversation about getting government spending back under a proportionate ratio. It is disproportionate at the moment. And if you speak to political commentators, they'd say, oh, well, there's no votes in talking about the debt. Well, A, that doesn't matter, but B, we have to make that an issue because as federal debt approaches $1 trillion, state debts here in Victoria is approaching $200 billion. The intergenerational report is very clear that this will have massive long-term consequences for future generations when in the top 5 line items of government spending, interest on debt is becoming the most expensive. It will surpass at some stage the NDIS, aged care, healthcare, defence. It is one of the top 5. So we need to address that. And to address it, you have to put bold solutions that puts a constraint on government spending being increased through inflation. And so I think the onus should be on a government to justify why it's increasing taxes or making spending cut decisions rather than go through this pantomime that says, well, you've got a tax cut, but it's really just giving you money back that you should have had, but for inflation that government probably caused.
But the trouble is that you're trying to sell a proposal that would really constrain spending at a time when people seem to want more and more from governments, rightly or wrongly.
I understand that, but I think if you keep spending at the ratios that we have, the institutions that we all care about, aged care, NDIS, healthcare, defence, they will collapse in on themselves. And so we won't be able to actually preserve them. This is about protecting them. So we have to find a way to make government spending more efficient. And you can do that in a way that minimizes cuts to frontline services. You can do that. It's hard, but that work should be done and that case should be made.
There have been criticisms of Angus Taylor's migration plans, and these include confining welfare to people who are citizens of Australia, excluding for the future permanent residents. Do you think that this will further alienate the ethnic voters from the coalition? And what should it be doing to try to rebuild support among communities that have been alienated, the Indian people, for example, the people of Chinese heritage? This is really causing a problem for the party.
I think like a lot of these issues, there are genuine concerns that then partisan actors feed and make worse through scare campaigns. I've looked at the social media scare campaigns that have been run on this, and what is missing from all of Labor's talking points is that the proposal by Angus Taylor is grandfathered. No one here who is a permanent resident is losing anything. So it is a lie. We can say lie here rather than the parliament. It is a lie to say that people who are permanent residents now will have those stripped from them. That's just not true. I don't think it's unreasonable going forward for people in future years who would look to come here to say that we want you to become a citizen. I think the focus on the negative is missing the point. Citizenship means something. Australia is not just an investment destination. It's not a shopping center. It's not a place you just put on your delivery address with Amazon. It is a nation that binds us all together. And the way that it binds us together is through citizenship. If this leads to more people becoming citizens, I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing. But when you speak to those communities, you can't generalize. They're extraordinarily hardworking Australians who want to pay less tax to keep more of what they earn. And they want the Liberal Party to fight for them on that front. And that means communicating with them where they are. So that doesn't mean this policy is perfect. It doesn't mean you can't revisit it later. But I think the Labor Party needs to be very careful how it runs these scare campaigns, because social cohesion matters, and it's very easy to categorise Australians in groups by just their heritage. But we should do so carefully, because in the end, you can do it in a way that takes communities for granted and seeks to treat them not seriously, not to take their concerns seriously. And so when you don't engage in a debate in good faith, or you're not honest with all of the facts, I think that is leading to more division in our country, and that's not healthy for our democracy.
But just to drill down on a couple of the problems of this welfare measure, and accepting that it's grandfathered for those here, people who come and become permanent residents in the future have to wait several years to become citizens. That's the first thing, and they wouldn't be eligible for a whole range of programs during that period. And secondly, to become citizens, in some cases, people have to renounce citizenship of other countries. In other words, they can't have dual citizenship. So isn't that going to lead to some injustices?
Any policy proposal can lead to injustices, and where that occurs, you should analyse and listen and adjust as required. But I think we're hopefully seeing Labor Party do that with some of their proposed reforms, and I think that should happen here. You should never just take it or leave it as to this proposal. So I would encourage the coalition to revisit this for any perverse or unfair or unjust outcomes. But again, Australia is entitled to put a premium on citizenship, to have benefits attached to it, as well as sacrifices. There are 103,000 names on our war memorial for people who, as Australians, have fought for this country, and we want more people to be part of that family, whatever their background. And we mustn't draft our rules according to what other countries' citizenship rules are. We are a sovereign nation, and we must draft our citizenship rules and the benefits and obligations that come with it from the national interest, as any other country would do.
Keith Wolahan, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll be watching your future in Menzies with some interest. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back again soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.